It has been said of the Russian peasant that he is poorest of all in the consciousness of his poverty. Of the ordinary Russian subject, it may be said that, while he is poor in civil rights, he is poorest of all in the consciousness of his lack of rights. Just as the peasant has grown accustomed to his wretched poverty, to living his life without pondering over the causes of his wretchedness, or the possibility of removing it, so the plain Russian subject has become accustomed to the omnipotence of the government, to living on without a thought as to whether the government can retain its arbitrary power any longer, and whether, side by side with it, there are not forces undermining the outmoded political system. A particularly good antidote to this political apathy and somnolence is usually contained in the secret documents, one which reveal that not only desperate cutthroats and confirmed enemies of the government, but also members of the government itself, including ministers, and even the Tsar, realize the tottering state of the autocracy and seek ways and means to improve their position, which they consider totally unsatisfactory. One such document is the memorandum drawn up by Witte, who, having quarreled with the Minister of the Interior, Goromikin, over the question of introducing Zemstvo institutions in the outlying regions, decided to display his perspicacity and his loyalty to the autocracy by drawing up an indictment against the Zemstvo. 2. The charge is leveled against the Zemstvo that it is incompatible with autocracy, that by its very nature it is constitutional, that its existence inevitably gives rise to friction and conflict between the representatives of the public and the government. The indictment is drawn up on the basis of vast, relatively and fairly well-prepared material, and since it is an indictment concerning a political affair, a rather peculiar one at that, we may be sure that it will be read with no less interest and will prove no less useful than were the indictments in political trials once published in our newspapers. Let us endeavor to determine whether the assertion that our Zemstvo is constitutional is borne out by the facts, and if so, to what extent, and in what precise sense. In this matter, the epoch in which the Zemstvo was introduced is of particular importance. The fall of serfdom was a historical event of such magnitude that it inevitably made a rent in the police veil concealing class antagonisms. The most solidified and best educated class, and the one most accustomed to political power, the nobility, displayed a very definite desire to restrict the power of the autocracy by means of representative institutions. The reference to this fact in Witte's memorandum is extremely instructive. He says, "Declarations concerning the necessity of representation for the nobility and concerning the right of the Russian nation to elect its representatives to advise the supreme authority were made at assemblies of nobles as far back as 1859-60. Even the word constitution was uttered. 3. Several gubernia. 4. Committees for the peasant question and individual members of committees called before the drafting commissions urged the necessity of drawing the public into participation in the administration. Deputies are openly striving for a constitution," wrote Nikitenko in his diary in 1859. When, after the promulgation of the regulations of February 19, 1861, 25. The hopes entertained in the autocracy were far from realized, and, moreover, when the redder elements in the administration, like N. Miliutin, were alienated from the implementation of the regulations, the movement in favor of representation became more nearly unanimous. It found expression in resolutions moved in many assemblies of nobles in 1862, and in petitions drawn up by the assemblies in Novgorod, Tula, Smolensk, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and there. The most remarkable of these was the Moscow petition, which pleaded for local self-government, public trials, obligatory redemption of peasant lands, publication of budgets, freedom of the press, and the convening in Moscow of a National Duma representing all classes for the purpose of drawing up a complete system of reforms. Sharpest were the decisions adopted in the petition drawn up by the nobility of there on February 2, urging the necessity of introducing a number of civil and economic reforms, e.g., equality of rights for all social estates, obligatory redemption of peasant lands and the convocation of elected representatives of the whole Russian nation as the only means for satisfactorily settling the questions raised, but not settled, in the regulations of February 19, 5. Despite the administrative and judicial penalties inflicted on the initiators of the Ver petition, 6. Continues Dragomanov, not for the petition directly, but for the sharp motivation attached to the collective resignation of the civil mediators. 26. Declarations in the same spirit were made at various assemblies of nobles in 1862 and early in 1863, at which projects for local self-government were also drawn up. At this time, a constitutional movement was in progress also among the Raznikinci. 27. Finding expression there in more or less revolutionary secret societies and proclamations. Velikoros, between August and November 1861, officers like Obruchev and others took part in its publication. Zemskaya Duma, 1862, Zemlya Valia, 1862-63, Velikoros published a draft petition which, as many said, was to have been submitted to the Tsar during the 1,000 Years of Russia celebrations. In August 1862, the draft petition stated inter alia, "May it please your Majesty to convene in one of the capitals of our Russian fatherland, in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, the representatives of the Russian nation in order that they may draw up a constitution for Russia." 7. If we recall also the proclamation to Young Russia, 28. The numerous arrests and the draconic punishments inflicted upon the political criminals, Obruchev, Mikhailov, and others, culminating in the frame-up of Chernyshevsky, 29, and his being sentenced illegally to penal servitude, we shall have a complete picture of the social situation that gave rise to the Zemstvo reform. Witte states only half the truth in his memorandum when he says that the idea underlying the establishment of Zemstvo institutions was undoubtedly a political one, that governing circles undoubtedly took into consideration the liberal and constitutionalist aspirations of the people. The hidebound official view on social phenomena, which the author of the memorandum reveals throughout, is here demonstrated by his ignoring the revolutionary movement and by his concealing the draconic measures of repression with which the government protected itself against the onset of the revolutionary party. True, from our modern viewpoint, it seems strange to speak of a revolutionary party and of its onset at the beginning of the 60s. 40 years of historical experience have made us more exacting with regard to what may be called revolutionary movements and revolutionary onsets. But it must not be forgotten that at that time, after 30 years of the rule of Nicholas I, no one could have foreseen the course of events. No one could have estimated the government's real strength of resistance or the real strength of the people's indignation. Even the most cautious and sober politician could not but acknowledge the possibility of a revolutionary outbreak and the serious danger of a peasant revolt. In the obtaining conditions of the revival of the democratic movement in Europe, the ferment in Poland, the discontent in Finland, the demands for political reforms made by the entire press and by all the nobility, the widespread distribution of Gogol throughout Russia, the powerful appeals of Chernyshevsky, who was able, by means even of censored articles, to educate genuine revolutionaries, the appearance of proclamations, the ferment among the peasants, who were, very often, compelled by armed force and bloodshed to accept the regulations that stripped them of everything, the refusal of whole groups of civil mediators from among the nobility to apply such regulations, and, finally, the student disorders. Under such circumstances, the autocratic government, which held it to be its lofty mission to protect, at all costs, the omnipotence and irresponsibility of the court camarilla and the army of official leeches, on the one hand, and to support the worst representatives of the exploiting classes, on the other, such a government had no other recourse than ruthlessly to exterminate individuals, the conscious and indomitable enemies of tyranny and exploitation, i.e., the ringleaders of the revolutionary party, terrify the masses of discontented people, and bribe them with small concessions, This meant penal servitude for those who preferred to remain silent rather than pour forth stupid or hypocritical phrases about the Great Emancipation. Reforms, innocuous for the autocracy and the exploiting classes, for those who waxed enthusiastic over the liberalism of the government and the era of progress. We do not wish to suggest that these calculated reactionary police tactics were clearly conceived and systematically pursued by all, or even by a few, of the members of the ruling clique. Some of them, on account of their narrow-mindedness, may not have pondered on the significance of these tactics as a whole and may have been childishly enthusiastic about liberalism, failing to observe its police mantling. In general, however, there is no doubt that the collective experience and collective reasoning of the rulers compelled them to pursue these tactics unswervingly. Not in vain did most of the grands and notables undergo a prolonged training in bureaucratic and police methods in the service of Nicholas I, and were, so to speak, case-hardened by fire and water. They remembered how sovereigns had at one time flirted with liberalism, and at another acted as the executioners of the Radishchevs, 30, and let loose the Arakcheyevs, 31, at their loyal subjects. They remembered December 14, 1825, 32, and they played the role of gendarme of Europe the Russian government had played in 1848-49, 33. The historical experience of autocracy not only compelled the government to pursue tactics of intimidation and corruption, but also compelled many independent liberals to recommend these tactics to the government. In proof of this, we shall quote the opinions of Kashalev and Kavelin. In his pamphlet, Constitution, Autocracy, and the National Duma, Leipzig, 1862, Kashalev expresses opposition to a constitution, advocates the convening of a National Advisory Duma, and anticipates the following objection. To convene a National Duma means to lead Russia towards revolution, i.e., to repeat, in Russia, the Edats Generale, 34, which were subsequently transformed into the Convention and which came to an end with the events of 1792, the proscriptions, the guillotine, the noyades, mass executions by drowning, etc. No, gentlemen, replied Kashalev, it will not be the convocation of a National Duma that will prepare the ground for revolution, as you understand it. Revolution will come much more surely and rapidly as a result of the hesitant and contradictory actions of the government, one step forward, one step backward, edicts and laws impossible of execution, the restraints placed upon thought and speech, as a result of the police, open, and what is worse, secret surveillance over the actions of the social estates and of private persons, the petty persecution of certain individuals, the plunder of the treasury, the squandering of public funds and the lavish granting of rewards, the incapacity of statesmen in their alienation from Russia, etc., etc. A country just awakening from centuries of oppression can be more surely driven to revolution, again as you understand it, by military executions, solitary confinement, and banishment, for rankling wounds are incomparably more sensitive and painful than fresh wounds. But have no fear, the revolution, which, as you suppose, was brought about in France by journalists and other writers, will not break out in Russia. Let us also hope that no society of desperate hotheads, who choose assassination as a means of attaining their ends, will be formed in Russia, although it is more difficult to vouch for that. What is more probable and dangerous is that, influenced by the split and unobserved by the rural, urban, and secret police, an alliance will be established between the peasants and the petty bourgeois townspeople, which will be joined by young and old, writers and adherents of Velikoros, Young Russia, etc. Such an all-destructive alliance, advocating equality, not before, but despite, the law. What matchless liberalism! We, of course, are in favor of equality, but not of equality despite the law which destroys equality. Not the popular, historical village commune, but its morbid progeny, and not the rule of reason which certain office holders fear so much, but the rule of brute force, which these office holders so readily employ. Such an alliance, one say, is far more probable in Russia and may be far more powerful than the moderate, well-meaning, and independent opposition to the government which our bureaucrats abhor so much and which they try so hard to restrict or suppress. Do not imagine that the party of the inner, secret, and anonymous press is small and weak. Do not imagine that you have plucked it out root and branch. No. By prevent lug the youth from completing their education, by treating youthful pranks as if they were political crimes, by petty persecution and police surveillance, you have increased the strength of that party tenfold, and have multiplied it and spread it throughout the empire. What will our statesmen resort to in the face of an outbreak resulting from such an alliance? Armed force? But will that be absolutely reliable? Pages 49-51. Do not the pompous phrases of this tirade obviously suggest the tactics? Destroy the Hotheads and the adherents of the alliance between the peasants and the petty bourgeois townspeople. Satisfy and disunite the well-meaning and moderate opposition through concessions. But the government proved to be cleverer and more agile than the Kishlevs imagined. It conceded much less than a National Advisory Duma. And the following from a private letter written by K.D. Kavalin to her son, 35, dated August 6, 1862. The news from Russia is not so bad, in my opinion. It was not Nicholas Soloveyevich that was arrested, but Alexander. The arrests do not surprise me and, I confess, do not seem to me outrageous. A revolutionary party considers every means to overthrow the government justified, while the government defends itself by every means at its disposal. Arrests and banishment under the reign of the despicable Nicholas were quite another thing. People then died for their ideas, their convictions, their faith, and their utterances. I would like to see you in the government's boots and see what you will do against a party that is secretly and openly working against you. I like Chernyshevsky very, very much, but never in my life have I seen such a brouillon, an irascible, unsociable bully, a sower of discord, such a tactless and cocksure fellow. To perish in vain, for absolutely no reason at all. There cannot be the least doubt now that the conflagrations have a connection with the leaflets. 10. What an example of servile professorial profundity! It is the revolutionaries who are to blame for everything. It is they who are conceited enough to hiss at phrase-mongering liberals, they who are so impudent as to work secretly and openly against the government and so tactless as to get themselves incarcerated in the fortress of Peter and Paul. He, too, the liberal professor, would punish people like these, with all the means at his disposal, were he in power. 2. Thus, the Zemstvo reform was one of the concessions forced from the autocratic government by public ferment and revolutionary pressure. We have dealt with the character of this pressure in detail in order to supplement and correct the picture outlined in the memorandum by its bureaucratic author, who obscured the struggle that had given rise to this concession. Nevertheless, the half-hearted and pusillanimous character of this concession is quite clearly described in the memorandum. At first, when the Zemstvo reform was just being undertaken, it was no doubt intended as a first step toward the introduction of representative institutions. 11. But later, when Count Lanskoy and N.A. Milyutin were replaced by Count Volyaev, there was an obvious desire, as even the ex-minister of the Interior admits, to act in a spirit of conciliation, softly and evasively. The government has no clear idea of its aims, he said at the time. In short, an attempt was made, unfortunately made so often by statesmen and always with bad results for everyone, to act evasively between two opposite opinions, to satisfy liberal aspirations and preserve the existing system. The pharisaical word, unfortunately, is highly amusing. A minister of the police government describes as casual the tactics which the government could not but pursue and did pursue in adopting the factory inspection laws, as well as the law on the reduction of the working day, June 2, 1897, and which it is now, 1901, pursuing in General Vanovsky's flirtation with the public. 36. On the one hand, it was stated in the explanatory memorandum attached to the regulations governing Zemstvo institutions that the purpose of the proposed law was to develop as completely and as consistently as possible the principle of local self-government, and that the Zemstvo administration is merely a special organ of one and the same state authority, Severnaya Pakta, then the organ of the Ministry of the Interior, hinted broadly that the institutions to be established were to serve as schools for representative bodies. On the other hand, the Zemstvo institutions are described in the explanatory memorandum as private and as public institutions, subject to the general laws in the same way as individual societies and private persons are subject. Both the provisions in the regulations of 1864 and, in particular, all the subsequent measures adopted by the Ministry of the Interior in relation to the Zemstvo institutions clearly indicate that the independence of the Zemstvo institutions was seen as a great danger, and that the government was afraid to permit the proper development of these institutions, being fully aware of what that would lead to. Our italics throughout. There is no doubt that those who had to carry out the Zemstvo reform did so merely as a concession to public opinion, in order, as the explanatory memorandum stated, to limit the unrealizable expectations and radical aspirations which have been aroused among the various social states in connection with the establishment of the Zemstvo institutions. At the same time, these people fully understood it, the reform, and strove to prevent the proper development of the Zemstvo, to give it a private character, restrict its powers, etc., while pacifying the liberals with the promise that the first step would not be the last in declaring, or, to be more precise, echoing the adherents of the liberal trend, that it was necessary to grant the Zemstvo institutions real and independent powers. Count Volyayev, in the very act of drafting the regulations of 1864, strove in every way to restrict the powers of those institutions and place them under strict administrative guardianship. Bereft of a single guiding idea, representing a compromise between two opposite trends, the Zemstvo institutions, in the form in which they were established by the regulations of 1864, proved in practice to be out of accord with the fundamental idea of local self-government on which they were based, as well as with the administrative system into which they were mechanically inserted and which, moreover, had neither been reformed nor adapted to the new conditions of life. The regulations of 181 sought to reconcile the irreconcilable and in that way to satisfy both the advocates and opponents of Zemstvo self-government. The former were offered superficialities and hopes for the future, while in order to satisfy the latter the powers of the Zemstvo institutions were given an extremely elastic definition. What pointed words our ministers sometimes accidentally let drop when they desire to put a spoke in the wheel of one of their colleagues and to display their profundity, and how useful it would be for every one of our self-complacent Russians and all admirers of the great reforms to hang on their walls in golden frames of wise police maxims, pacify the liberals with the promise that the first step will not be the last, offer them superficialities and hopes for the future. It would be particularly useful at the present time to refer to these precepts when reading in articles or other items in newspapers about General Vanovsky's heartfelt solicitude. Thus, from the very beginning, the Zemstvo was doomed to serve as a fifth wheel to the wagon of Russian state administration, a wheel tolerated by the bureaucracy only insofar as it would not disturb its absolute authority, while the role of the representatives of the population was restricted to the simple technical fulfillment of the functions outlined by this very bureaucracy. The Zemstvos had no executive organs of their own, they had to act through the police, they had no contact with one another, and they were immediately placed under the control of the administration. Having made such a harmless concession, the government, on the very day after the establishment of the Zemstvos, began systematically to impose restrictions upon them. The almighty bureaucratic clique could not reconcile itself to the elected representation of the social estates and began to persecute it in every possible way. A very interesting part of the memorandum is the summary of facts on this persecution, notwithstanding its obvious incompleteness. We have seen how pusillanimous and irrational was the attitude of the liberals towards the revolutionary movement at the beginning of the 60s. Instead of supporting the alliance of the petty bourgeois townspeople and the peasants with the adherents of Velichorus, they feared this alliance and held it as a bogey with which to scare the government. Instead of rising to the defense of the leaders of the democratic movement, persecuted by the government, they pharisaically washed their hands of them and justified the action of the government. This treacherous policy of grandiloquence and shameful flabbiness met with poetic justice. Having dealt with those who proved themselves capable, not merely of jabbering about liberty, but of fighting for it, the government felt sufficiently strong to squeeze the liberals out of even the minor and inferior positions which they had occupied, with the permission of the authorities. So long as the alliance of the petty bourgeois townspeople and the peasants with the revolutionaries represented a serious menace, the Ministry of the Interior itself mumbled words about a school of representative institutions. But when the tactless and cocksure hecklers and hotheads had been removed, the scholars were treated with an iron hand. Then a tragicomedical epic began. The Zemstvo appealed for an extension of its rights, but was deprived of one right after another and given fatherly homilies in answer to its petitions. But let the historical dates, even those presented in the memorandum, speak for themselves. On October 12, 1866, the Ministry of the Interior issued a circular subordinating the Zemstvo employees completely to government institutions. On November 21 a law was passed restricting the right of the Zemstvo in taxing commercial and industrial establishments. The St. Petersburg Zemstvo Assembly, in 1867, sharply criticized this law, and, on the proposal of Count Shuvalov, adopted a decision to petition the government to arrange for the questions touched upon by this law to be discussed by the combined forces and with the simultaneous efforts of the central administration and the Zemstvo. The government's answer to this petition was to close down the St. Petersburg Zemstvo institutions and to resort to reprisals. The chairman of the St. Petersburg Zemstvo Board, Cruz, was banished to Orenburg, Count Shuvalov, to Paris, and Senator Lubozhinsky was ordered to resign. Severnaya Pakta, organ of the Ministry of the Interior, published an article in which these stern measures of punishment were explained by the fact that the Zemstvo assemblies, too, from the very opening of their sessions, had acted contrary to the law. To what law? And why were the lawbreakers not brought to trial, when only shortly before a speedy, just, and merciful court procedure had been introduced? That instead of supporting the Zemstvo assemblies of other gubernias, utilizing for that purpose the rights which His Majesty has graciously granted them for exercising proper care over the local economic interests of the Zemstvo in their charge, i.e., instead of being humbly submissive and following the intentions of the officialdom, they strove continuously, by falsely explaining the case and misinterpreting the laws, to rouse sentiments of mistrust and lack of respect for the government. After such an admonition, it is not surprising that the other Zemstvos failed to support the St. Petersburg Zemstvo, although the law of November 21, 1866, had everywhere given rise to deep-going discontent, so that at meetings many people declared it to be tantamount to destroying the Zemstvos. On December 16, 1866, the Senate issued a clarification granting the governors of the gubernias the right to refuse endorsement to any person elected by a Zemstvo assembly whom the respective governor deemed politically unreliable. On May 4, 1867, there followed another Senate interpretation to the effect that communication of Zemstvo proposals to other gubernias was contrary to law, since Zemstvo institutions must concern themselves only with local affairs. On June 13, the Council of State issued a ruling, with imperial sanction, prohibiting publication of decisions, minutes, reports of discussions, etc., of the meetings of Zemstvo, urban, and social estate assemblies without the consent of the gubernia authorities. Further, That law extended the powers of chairmen of Zemstvo assemblies. It granted them the right to close meetings at their discretion and imposed upon them the obligation, under threat of punishment, to close any meeting at which questions not in consonance with the law were presented for discussion. The public greeted this measure with hostility, regarding it as a serious restriction of Zemstvo activity. Everyone knows, Nikotenko entered in his diary, that the Zemstvos are tied hand and foot by the new regulations, which give the chairmen of assemblies and the governors of gubernias almost unlimited powers over them. The circular of October 8, 1868 makes it obligatory to obtain the consent of the governor for the publication even of the reports of the Zemstvo boards and restricts intercommunication between Zemstvos. In 1869 the office of Inspector of Elementary Schools was established for the purpose of taking the effective management of elementary education out of the hands of the Zemstvos. A regulation issued by the Committee of Ministers on September 19, 1869, which received imperial sanction, declares that, neither in their composition nor in their fundamental principles are Zemstvo institutions governmental authorities. The law of July 4 and the circular of October 22, 1870 confirm and increase the subordination of Zemstvo employees to the governors of the gubernias. In 1871 instructions were issued to the inspectors of elementary schools empowering them to dismiss teachers who were deemed politically unreliable and to suspend all decisions of the school councils and submit them to the school guardians for their sanction. On December 25, 1873, Alexander II, in a rescript addressed to the Minister of Education, expressed the fear that unless proper guardianship and control are exercised over them, the elementary schools may be converted into an instrument for the moral corruption of the people, some attempts at which have already been disclosed, and he ordered the marshals of the nobility, by their close cooperation, to preserve the moral influence of the schools. In 1874 a new regulation concerning the elementary schools was issued, which placed the management of the schools entirely in the hands of the headmasters. The Zemstvo protested. If a petition pleading that the law be revised and that the representatives of the Zemstvo take part in this revision, the petition of the Kazan Zemstvo in 1874 can, without irony, be described as a protest. Of course, the petition was rejected, etc., etc.